State. And we have Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick. How are you this morning?
Oh, great. And it's great to have you back on again, Dr. John. We had a few questions come in last week, Dr. John. And, of course, one of them was, why is mutation not evolving? Because that is change. Now, of course, we ask for questions every week because Dr. John's from Creation Ministries International. And whilst they do have a website, it's called creation.com, people send their questions in to us as well, and Dr. John answers them on air so as everyone can hear the answers, because quite often a lot of people have the same questions. So that question again was, why is mutation not evolving? Because that is change.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, actually, because it's absolutely true that whenever you read a scientific study that talks about change in something, they call it evolution. And, of course, the very word mutation actually means change. And remember, we talked a few weeks back, we were talking about the way elephants are now becoming, or female elephants anyway, becoming tuskless. So, of course, the articles call that evolution, but of course it's not, and we explained at the time why it isn't evolution.
Yes.
So why isn't change evolution? Well, to answer the question, we really have to look at what a mutation is. And you've got to go right back to the structure of DNA and RNA. And you've got to look at what they are. And, of course, they're actually biological programs, but on a very, very tiny scale. You know, when we think of our terms like milli, as in millimetre, and then the millimetre, milli means 1,000th, micro means 1,000,000th, nano means 1,000,000,000th, and pico means 1,000,000,000th, you know, tiny, tiny, tiny scales.
Yep.
And that's the sort of scale that we're talking about with these programs. And the programs for DNA and RNA are actually linked nucleotide bases. They are organic chemical compounds, and the order of their linkage constitutes the program. Now, each of them, DNA and RNA, have got 4 of these nucleotide bases in their program. They're the same, except there's one difference between DNA and RNA, but they function in the same way. And we give them their first letters, A, T, G, and C, so that when you line them up, you can see that there's a program. Now, we're all familiar with computer programs, you know, or if you look at a link on your computer to a particular news article, for example, it's a series of keyboard symbols in a particular order. Now, our keyboards have got a lot of symbols, but they're all actually a combination of only 2. So there's really only 2 keyboard symbols. And a mutation, as in a computer program or in DNA or RNA, is where one of those symbols, or bases in the case of DNA, one of those symbols gets substituted by another. Now, that's a corruption to the program, and it either won't run at all or it runs worse. You don't find that the corruptions make it run better. And we have to remember that every properly running program has been written by a programmer. They're all intelligently designed, because programs don't write themselves. And even tiny biological entities like viruses, and, you know, viruses are fairly tiny, but they're very substantial programs. Now, a coronavirus, for example, and there are a lot of them apart from the one that we're all familiar with, that's got about 30,000 nucleotide bases in its program, which, you know, 30,000 is quite substantial. And viruses tend to get lots of mutations. They get changes, and they're usually damaging to the original program. Now, we're seeing that with the COVID virus, because some of the mutations seem to make it easier for it to gain entry to our bodies, but they're not as harmful. So there's probably no reason for people to go into a huge panic about this latest one, the Omicron variant, so-called. Mm-hmm. But the point is, viruses and bacteria originally are designed. We've got billions of them in our bodies, and they're mostly working in perfect harmony. And it's only when something goes wrong that they become harmful. Mm-hmm. Now, God did the original design, and everything was designed to be in perfect symbiotic harmony. But a lot of the disharmony that we see has been man-caused. You know, if you think of man causing disharmony, the entry of sin was obviously the original cause. Mm-hmm. But when we think of things like antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and we've talked about that a couple of times in the last few weeks, that's been caused by man. Mm-hmm. And, it's very probable that man's manipulation and fiddling with the current virus has caused the problems that we're facing now. And, when the truth eventually gets revealed, I think people will be very surprised to see how much man's interference has done it. So mutations don't add any additional information, which is what would be required for evolution to be true. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they corrupt the existing information. And maybe we can go into that in a little bit more detail when we come back.
Absolutely. It is 16 minutes past 8. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And, International. And he's been talking to us this morning about why basically mutation isn't evolution. And it's very interesting, Dr. John. Of course, there's always change, and you've talked many times about how, most change that we see is a breaking down of information as opposed to a building up of information. And that type of mutation is not so much evolution as de-evolution.
Yeah, well, you could call it that, and mutations don't ever add any additional information, and that's what would be required for evolution to be true. What they do is they corrupt the existing information, but they don't add any more. Yeah. And when you think about the whole general belief in evolution, if there ever was an original first life, like evolutionists believe, it would have had to have added more and more genetic information, for example, to turn an amoeba into a fish. Mm-hmm. And then it's going to have to add more information to turn the fish into the amphibian and let it crawl out of the water onto land and so on. And then more information to turn the amphibian into a reptile, and then more to turn it into a mammal, and there's just no evidence that that's ever occurred. Yeah. And mutational changes corrupt the program; they don't improve it. So that's really why we can't call these changes evolution. And evolution demands upward progress, that is, increase in complexity. And there's no evidence that it's ever occurred by random chance or addition of genetic information. And that's what's believed, but we have to realize that belief in evolution is actually blind faith, because it's never been observed. And that's why we constantly say at Creation Ministries that we're not talking about a religious view versus a scientific view. Mm-hmm. We're talking about two religious views, two views based on faith, because both creation and evolution are faith positions. Yep. Now, our claim is that when you compare these two religious views, that is the creation religious view and the evolution religious view, the scientific evidence backs up the creation view, and it doesn't support the evolution religious view. So it's not a conflict between religion and science, it's a conflict between two religious views, and as we say, the scientific evidence definitely supports our religious view rather than the evolutionary religious view.
Yes, I agree. And too often, though, we see those scientific reports that are pointing in the other direction. But so often we talk about as well, science as not particularly being, science that's measured with an instrument. It's science that people have made up a whole lot of conclusions from nothing. They've sort of, just made stuff up and painted pictures that aren't really there.
Well, that's correct, and this is what we also talk about a lot at Creation Ministries, the difference between the two types of science, because when we use the expression science, people think of scientists in white coats in laboratories and being able to devise things that send men to the moon and all the new technology that gets devised. And, of course, that's what we might call operational science. But it's very different from historical science.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we'll come back to Dr. John very soon, 9. And I'm with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's been talking to us this morning about how change, any type of change is not necessarily evolution, particularly mutation isn't evolution because things are breaking down, not building up, which is very interesting and sadly not what the scientists say very often.
Yeah, and we got another question too, Mick, that follows on a bit about that from dogs.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, sorry. Not from dogs, about dogs.
Yes. The question we had, it was, how did we get to over 200 breeds of dogs? Was there only one breed to start with? And I'm guessing they mean one breed to start with that got off the ark.
Yeah, well, whether or not the secular world believes it got off the ark is another issue. I don't think they do, but certainly the secular world thinks that there was only the one breed to begin with.
Either way, it works the same way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the secular world believes that all dogs are descended from a wolf-like ancestor. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we would say that all dogs are descended, as you say, from the pair or pairs that survived the flood, the ones on the ark with Noah. And it's interesting that we don't know how many dogs there were, because Noah was told to take one pair of every unclean animal and possibly 7 pairs of clean animals. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know whether dogs were classified as unclean animals or clean animals. So there could have only been one pair of dogs on the ark, which certainly would have been a wolf-like dog. Mm-hmm. But there could have been up to 7 pairs, and most probably they were all a bit similar to that. But within the survivors of the ark, there would obviously have been an enormous amount of genetic diversity.
Yes. And
no matter what the dog breed, we can say that they're all still dogs, and they can all interbreed. And even if they're very, very different, it doesn't make any difference. The various breeds of dogs can interbreed. And as everybody knows, now we're getting a whole lot of crossbred type dogs. We're getting lots of labradoodles and spandoodles and cockadoodles and all of those other mixed breeds that we get in the pet shops.
Yep.
But no new genetic information is being created.
Yeah.
What's already there is just being reshuffled as man starts to put his breeding hat on. Mm-hmm. And, of course, man has actually created a very, very large problem with a lot of those dog breeds. Mm-hmm. Now, most of it is genetic reshuffling. Some of it's due to mutations. And as we've said many times, those mutations are generally harmful. But the genetic reshuffling causes lots of problems as well. And people have gone for a lot of the pedigreed breeds because you can usually get a guaranteed temperament. Now, that's very handy if the dog's going to live with young children. You want a pretty docile temperament dog.
Yeah.
But other dogs with different temperaments are particularly useful as guard dogs or guide dogs. And but most pedigreed dogs have got their own problems. And part of that problem has actually been caused by dog shows. Mm-hmm. Now, the most prestigious dog show in the world is Crufts in England. And a few years ago, there were calls for shows like Crufts to be banned because of the damage that was being done to certain dog breeds. Mm-hmm. And there was even a complaint on one year that the dog that won Best in Show had plastic surgery. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, that was true. And the problem really arises when the judges start looking for particular characteristics that might, over time, completely change the appearance of the dog.
Yes.
And a good example is the modern British Bulldog. It's nothing like the old British Bulldogs in appearance, which a lot of the old paintings of hunts show the old type British Bulldog, but the modern ones are completely different. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to talk about Bulldogs in a minute. But if we go back to the plastic surgery accusation, I think the dog that won the Best in Show on that particular occasion was a Pomeranian. Mm-hmm. And because the judges are looking for such things like flatter type faces in these dogs, the winner that had that desirable characteristic had to have part of its soft palate removed to enable it to breathe. That's where the plastic surgery came in. And this is where it becomes a problem, particularly if the dog is a male, and I think that particular one was.
Yeah.
Because it then becomes in great demand as a sire, because everybody with that breed wants to go and win at the dog shows.
Yep.
And that means, particularly if it's male, that the favoured characteristic is going to be passed on to multiple offspring. Mm-hmm. Now, that might earn the owner a lot of money and prestige, but it doesn't do the dogs any good. Mm. And I think you might be aware, Mick, there's a similar problem with Cavalier King Charles Spaniels. Mm-hmm. They're very pretty dogs, and part of the prettiness is in their lovely little flat face. But this has meant that their cranial cavity, the brain case, is reduced in size, but their brains haven't reduced in size. So they get forced back into the spinal column, and the dogs have epileptic fits. Mm. And most of the pedigreed problems have got some, most of the pedigreed breeds have got some existing problem. Mm. And we can probably talk about those problems when we come back.
Absolutely. It is 8:45. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International on the line, and we've been talking about dogs. How did we get to over 200 breeds of dogs when there was only one breed to start with? And that wouldn't matter whether you were thinking about maybe the ark, or when dogs first ever dog was sort of created. Look, as far as one breed, Dr. John says maybe there was 7 that got off the ark, but regardless, how did we end up with 200 of them? Is that evolution, Dr. John?
No, it's not evolution, Mick. It's just reshuffling of the genetic information that was in those original dogs. But of course, we've in the modern world we've had the interfering hand of man trying to create pedigreed breeds with particular characteristics. And I mean, a lot of the pedigreed breeds are very, very popular, but the longer the pedigree, the more the unfavourable characteristics are concentrated. And I'm going to mention Bulldogs in a minute, but my daughter had a couple of pugs, and they're lovely little dogs, but they've got terrible breathing problems because of their flat faces, and they have very, very reduced life expectancies. I think her pugs both died definitely under 10 years old, maybe only about 7 or 8. So that's the sort of thing that you get when you start to concentrate favourable characteristics, but along with that you concentrate the unfavourable ones as well.
Yep.
And of course, the classic, I suppose, is the Bulldogs, both the French Bulldogs and the British Bulldogs. And one of the most popular and very, very expensive breeds at the moment is the French Bulldog. And just like the British Bulldog, they're bred for appearance and to a large extent what the show judges are looking for. But these dogs have heads which are too large for their mother's pelvis. So all the puppies for French Bulldogs and British Bulldogs have to be born by cesarean.
Wow.
Clearly without human intervention, the females would die in labour. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many of the crossbreeds now, and I mentioned the Labradoodles and the Spandoodles before, because looking for long pedigrees concentrates the adverse characteristics as well as the desired ones.
Yep.
So the best way to counter that is to introduce a new set of genetics by crossbreeding. And that way you might be able to continue some of the desired characteristics, like, a very docile dog for being around children, and get rid of some of the bad ones. Yep. And it's a real problem, and animal lovers are quite right to point out that man's interference might make him happy, but it can be very harmful and unfair to the dog. And once again, we can see how sin has a terrible adverse impact, because prestige, pride, and human greed are very, very powerful forces. And, Mick, we haven't even mentioned greyhounds, and, the problem with greyhounds is another story when we're getting on to dogs. But look, to summarise, I suppose, with the dogs, they're probably the best example of the amount of genetic diversity that can be present, because most experts do agree that the original dog was a wolf-like creature, and the huge diversity in appearance is really a great example of how genetic reshuffling can work. Now, they may look very different, but they're all the one kind. They're all the dog kind, and they never change into cats.
Yeah.
But they can be very different, and regular listeners will know when we talk about kinds that a couple of weeks ago I mentioned about a guy in Shepparton in Victoria who'd grafted a record number of different fruits onto the one tree, and some of those fruits, I suppose, were not all that different, peaches, apricots and plums and so on, but one of them was almonds, and who would have ever thought that almonds were part of the same kind as peaches and apricots?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have expected that, would you, Mick?
No, not at
So you've got to stick with the kind. The dog kind never changes into the cat kind.
Yes.
And that really is why we one of the things that at Creation Ministries causes us to say evolution is impossible, because there has never been any evidence of one kind changing into another.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, that was really interesting, and that came from a few questions from our listeners, and we thank you guys for those questions. Of course, if you have any more questions, send them through to 0401 949 949. That is our text line. Dr. John, we had another question come through in regards to watching Universe with Brian Cox on ABC2 last night. How do we identify the just so stories from the facts when they're intermixed? That might be one for next week. But thank you so much, Dr. John. Another awesome week. And I've got a feeling that next week we have one of your other CMI guys coming on.
Yeah, next week is going to be a real special, because you're going to have Dr. Mark Harwood. And he's a real he's a real rocket scientist. He's responsible for the Optus communication satellites. So that'll be very, very interesting. And that Brian Cox question could be one that you can pop to him, Mick, because he'll be able to answer that very, very well.
Sounds good. Well, it's rocket scientist from Creation Ministries International next Tuesday morning, so tune on in. And thank you again, Dr. John. We'll be hearing from you in just a couple of weeks' time. Have an awesome couple of weeks.
Yeah, I will, Mick. I'll have a breather next week, and I'll listen into you talking to Dr. Harwood.
Sounds exciting, Dr. Mark Harwood. You're on 94.9. It is 5 minutes to 9. Good morning.